What if humans were immortal? Imagine a world where the boundaries of life and death have been shattered, where the finality that has governed every living thing for millennia simply ceases to exist. What if, through some miracle of science, nature, or divine intervention, human beings became immortal, not immune to harm or injury, but no longer subject to the slow, inescapable decay of aging and death by natural causes? In this world, humans would live indefinitely unless killed by accident, disease, or violence. The impact of such a profound change would ripple through every facet of society, from the most intimate corners of everyday existence to the grandest scales of history and civilization. At first, the realization would come quietly for some, suddenly and dramatically for others. People would notice their hair stop turning gray, their skin retaining its elasticity and glow. The aches and pains of age would simply vanish, and those already suffering from age-related conditions might find themselves healing in ways previously thought impossible. Rumors would spread until confirmation is undeniable, setting off a tidal wave of emotion across the planet. Shock, disbelief, euphoria, and for some, fear of the unknown. Families would look at their oldest members, fathers, mothers, grandmothers, great-grandfathers, and realize that age has been conquered. For the first time, children would not have to fear the inevitable loss of their parents to the ticking clock of mortality. Great-grandchildren might watch in awe as their elders regain vitality, strength, and perhaps even youthful appearances. The line between generations would begin to blur, with age no longer serving to define experience or wisdom. In those initial years, the world would shimmer with possibility. Freed from the specter of aging, people might embrace daring dreams discarded in youth. Ancient bucket lists would be revisited and reimagined. Some would plunge into new careers, study new languages, or wander the globe, knowing they finally have time to see and do everything. The fear of running out of time would wither, replaced by an emboldened sense of curiosity. Those previously hesitant to build or explore might throw themselves into projects that span centuries, confident that they will see their work to completion. But as decades turned into centuries, society would grapple with the consequences of endless life. One of the earliest and most pressing issues would be population growth. In a world where no one dies of old age, the population would climb at an extraordinary rate. Even if birth rates slowed, the accumulation of people would place immense strain on resources: food, water, housing, and energy. Families might need to reconsider how many children to have, and governments worldwide would wrestle with the ethics of population control. New societal norms could emerge, encouraging smaller families and longer waiting times between generations. The scarcity of resources would drive innovation. Urban landscapes would transform, with cities expanding vertically and underground. Agricultural technology would boom to feed the swelling numbers, from vertical farms to lab-grown meats. Deserts might bloom with hydroponics, and oceans might host floating cities. The pressure to colonize new frontiers, first in remote, inhospitable regions, and later on other planets, would grow to a fever pitch. The human drive to survive and adapt would be tested as never before, pushing science and technology at a dizzying pace. Culturally, immortality would reshape the human experience. The urgency that once underpinned art and creativity might fade, replaced by a luxurious patience. Artists could spend centuries perfecting their craft, creating works of unimaginable complexity and depth. Musicians, writers, and inventors could return to and revise their masterpieces across the ages, never having to leave their legacy to others. The idea of a magnum opus would take on new meaning, as some works might be refined for hundreds, even thousands of years. Language, too, would evolve. As generations accumulate without end and societies become stratified by age, new dialects, words, and forms of expression would emerge. Perhaps linguistic enclaves would preserve old forms, while the young and old would develop their own ways of speaking. There would be people alive who have first-hand memories stretching back centuries, able to recount events with a vividness historians could only have dreamed of. Oral histories would expand, and elders would carry wisdom that spans entire epochs. Education would become a lifelong pursuit, in the truest sense. With endless time, the compulsion to rush through school to meet the demands of work would dissipate. People could devote decades to studying the arts, sciences, philosophy, and history. Institutions of knowledge would transform, offering curricula for every stage of eternal life. Memory retention and storage would become ever more important, leading perhaps to technological enhancement. Artificial memory banks, digital augmentation, or even direct neural uploading, so that minds don't become overwhelmed by 1,000 years of lived experience. This technological transformation would not stop at education. Medicine and bodily enhancement would continue to advance, aiding those who suffer death by non-age-related circumstances, car accidents, diseases, or violence. Regenerative medicine would make fixing injuries commonplace, and new organs or limbs could be regrown or printed on demand. Genetic engineering might allow people to modify their appearance, physical capabilities, or even cognitive function, further blurring the very boundaries that defined humanity in previous centuries. Relationships and family life would be revolutionized. Marriages and friendships, once counted in decades and celebrated for longevity, would face new dilemmas. What does forever mean when it is true, rather than an ideal? Divorce and separation might no longer bear the same social stigma as couples rethink the prospect of endless partnership. Friendships might drift and rekindle over centuries, and families would become sprawling entities with living ancestors tracing their lines hundreds of generations deep. Identity itself might shift throughout the centuries. A person could experiment with new names, careers, locations, and even personalities. Love would endure, but its nature would change. The heartbreak of outliving a partner would be rare, shifted to accidents or rare fatal illnesses rather than the steady ticking of years. Parents and children could grow together for eternity, transforming from guardianship to peer relationships and back again throughout the eons. The rituals around birth, coming of age, and death would morph. Funerals would all but disappear, replaced by ceremonies marking other milestones. Birthdays, as a marker of age, might lose their meaning, replaced by celebrations of achievement, self-reinvention, or saved lives after disaster. The psychological implications of immortality would run deep. That sense of urgency that drives creativity, ambition, and risk-taking might erode. Would people lose their drive, knowing they can always try again, or put things off for another decade, century, or millennia? Some may become bored, seeing a repetition of events, ideas, and failures. Ennui, existential boredom, could become an acute collective affliction as people struggle to find meaning without the limiting force of mortality. For those unable to find purpose, life could become a burden rather than a blessing. On the other hand, eternal life might drive new quests for meaning. Some would devote themselves to quests for knowledge, art, love, or spirituality. Religious perspectives would undergo seismic shifts. If heaven or hell is no longer a looming certainty, faith traditions would be forced to adapt, redefine their roles, and grapple with whether immortality is a divine gift, a curse, or a challenge. New philosophies would emerge to answer the question, if life is endless, how do we make it worth living? The rhythms of history would change forever. Wars might not be fought by the young anymore, as armies of ageless humans return to conflict generation after generation. Old grudges and ideological battles could persist for centuries. On the other hand, the collective memory of war, tragedy, and peace would be far more vivid. Societies might become more cautious, hoping to preserve peace for those who still vividly recall the horrors of generations past. Leadership would transform. Monarchs, politicians, or visionaries, once limited by the span of a human life, could rule, inspire, or dominate for centuries, unless institutions enforced term limits or revolutions dethroned them. The question of succession, so central throughout history, would be upended. Power could become concentrated in the hands of a few immortal elites, threatening to freeze social mobility and progress. Alternatively, the growth of collective wisdom and consensus might lead to more stable and prosperous societies, guided by leaders with centuries of experience. Technology in an immortal world would know no bounds. With unlimited time and accumulated expertise, ambitious projects like terraforming planets, building interstellar spacecraft, or constructing artificial ecosystems would become feasible. The timeline of human development would stretch without end, giving rise to civilizations that could span worlds. The pursuit of knowledge itself would reach heights unimaginable to those bound by mortality, and humanity might finally answer many of the riddles of existence, from the nature of consciousness to the fundamental mysteries of the cosmos. Yet, even in this utopia of endless life, the threat of death would not be eliminated, only transformed. Disease, accidents, violence, natural disasters, and even suicide would still claim lives. The tools for destruction would become more terrible as technology advanced, with the danger of weapons capable of erasing cities, continents, or even planets. Moral and ethical dilemmas would haunt survivors of tragedy, as the loss of anyone might seem all the more unbearable, with the sure knowledge that, without such tragedy, that person could have lived forever. For those tired of living, perhaps through centuries of sorrow, loss, or boredom, the desire for a final escape would be real. The right to end one's life might become a contentious ethical question. Is suicide more justifiable in the absence of natural death? Institutions might emerge to help people decide when, if ever, it is time to move on to whatever lies beyond. The idea of an exit, of a peaceful, chosen end, could become part of societal norms, providing relief for those who have seen enough. Artistic and scientific communities would undergo rapid and profound transformation. Endless years would yield unparalleled mastery, but also more intense, sometimes paralyzing pressure to create something truly original. The canon of human knowledge and artistic achievement would become so vast that newcomers might find it impossible to invent, discover, or create something genuinely new. Rediscovery, reinterpretation, and fusion of old ideas might become as valued as invention, and the role of the individual genius might fade in favor of collective or collaborative endeavors. Economic structures would be profoundly challenged. Retirement would disappear as a concept, and the workforce would swell with the ever-living. Jobs and careers might be limited in time by regulations to allow others opportunities. Perhaps individuals could choose to retrain and reinvent themselves every few centuries, entering entirely new professions with confidence and wisdom. Wealth, too, would become more concentrated unless radical redistribution occurred. Inherited fortunes could accumulate across millennia, making the gap between rich and poor unimaginably vast. The criminal justice system would face new quandaries. With endless lives, the prospect of life imprisonment would become a different, potentially more horrifying fate. Legal systems would need to evolve to justly balance punishment, rehabilitation, and mercy. Perpetrators of crime would no longer escape justice through natural demise. Their actions would echo through the centuries. The environment would face unprecedented strain. Without constraints on population, the planet could buckle under the weight of countless bodies, polluting, consuming, and competing for space and resources. Humanity would face a stark choice: to radically transform behaviors, perhaps imposing strict regulations and innovations to preserve the biosphere, or risk collapse and extinction through overuse. The push to colonize space might become a desperate necessity rather than a utopian dream. With more people living for centuries, perhaps environmental consciousness would deepen, born from first-hand memory of disasters and successes. An immortal generation who vividly recalls the biodiversity of Earth's golden ages may fight endlessly to preserve or even resurrect lost species and habitats. Bioengineering could offer tools to reverse damage, restore ecosystems, and consciously guide evolution for future millennia. Interpersonal conflict could cycle and deepen. With personal histories that stretch back for ages, old disputes could harden into eternal vendettas, much as in ancient feuds that never fade. Alternatively, the wisdom and perspective of endless years might allow forgiveness and empathy to flourish, smoothing the rough edges of human nature. Shared goals, like the preservation or exploration of the species, might eclipse individual or tribal concerns. At a psychological level, existential questions would predominate. Would immortality strip life of its urgency, leading to a kind of spiritual malaise? Or would it inspire humanity to create deeper and more lasting sources of meaning and joy? Philosophers might wrestle for centuries with the implications of endless life, writing tomes and treatises beyond the scope of any one era. Religious and spiritual traditions would evolve or fragment in response to the new reality. Identity would become fluid. People might reinvent themselves over centuries, moving through phases, interests, careers, and personas with each passing epoch. Friendships, rivalries, and alliances might rise and fall, echoing the shifting patterns of civilization itself. As humanity adapts over the ages, so too would technology continue to close the gap between the possible and impossible. Neural enhancements could help manage vast lifespans of memories, perhaps allowing people to archive certain eras of their lives until needed, or even temporarily forget and rediscover passions, relationships, and knowledge. Artificial intelligence would become an ever more integral partner, helping to curate experiences, organize civilization, and drive discovery at scales that defy comprehension. Society might need to develop new rites of passage, new aspirations, and new social contracts. The cherished firsts, first love, first achievement, first child, might lose their gravity, replaced by quests for deep wisdom, collaboration, or transcendence. Rituals of rebirth, renewal, and self-transformation could become centerpieces of culture, helping immortals structure their endless existence into chapters that are meaningful and manageable. The relationship between humanity and mortality would be forever changed, while the sting of loss would never truly vanish, and while risk and danger would remain, the certainty of decay and aging would be gone. In its place would stand an infinite possibility, a canvas upon which to paint the destiny of a species unbound. Whether humanity would ascend to ever greater heights or wither into apathy and stagnation would depend on the choices made by each generation. And, in this world, every generation would remain ever present to shape its fate. Ultimately, the question of what if humans were immortal is less about the mechanics of living forever and more about the endless adaptability of the human spirit. Would we find endless joy in discovery, in love, in creation, or would we spiral into boredom and despair? The answer, as ever, would be determined by how we choose to spend our limitless hours, whether in pursuit of connection, achievement, and growth, or in retreat from the weight of our own, unending existence. So, as the centuries roll by in this imagined world, new patterns of society, technology, and culture would emerge. Conflict and cooperation would both know no bounds. History would not be a story of generations rising and falling, but of a single, unbroken human narrative, stretching endlessly into the future, always changing, always grappling with the meaning of a life that, for the first time, has no natural end.